The bad case scenario, which ultimately will happen if we don't change this trajectory, is that analogous to what we've seen in some countries in Europe, that investors will begin to lose confidence that we can manage our long-term fiscal situation, and we'll see sharp movements in interest rates or loss of confidence in U.S. debt, in which case changes would have to be made, but in a much more chaotic, rapid, and a disruptive way than by doing it in a long-term, thoughtful way.
Thank you. Mr. Blumenauer.
Thank you. Thank you again, sir, for joining us. I cringed a little with my good friend from New Jersey's portrayal. It seems to me that you are independent of Congress. You're not CBO. You are managing the monetary system, and you are purposefully an independent agency trying to insulate the notion that somehow you're at the beck and call of a particular administration or Congress. My understanding is that's the structure that is in place to try and give you that independence. Am I missing something here?
Well, the Fed was created by Congress, but Congress did set us up in a way, for example, 14-year terms for governors and so on, to try to create independence in making monetary policy decisions. We have a number of roles, including supervisory roles and so on, which bring us into contact with issues related to housing and mortgages and so on. But again, I just want to be clear to this committee that our intention was to try to provide useful background, and we, in all cases, looked at both sides of the issue, and we recognize, we have no doubt whatsoever that it's Congress that has to make those decisions.
And I appreciate that. And I am of the, having been here through some of the stormy weather, I think there are lessons to be learned by all of us. I think you, some of your governors, looking at the events. I hope Congress is looking at what we did or didn't do. Hopefully people in the private sector. The notion that somehow we might ask the Fed to come up with a report on the Recovery Act. I mean, there is an independent agency. It's called the CBO, which we set up to give us that, who produced such a report that said that it raised real inflation-adjusted GDP between 0.3% and 1.9%, that it lowered the unemployment rate between 0.2% and 1.3%. It increased the number of employed between 400,000 and 2.4 million, and increased the number of full-time equivalent jobs by between 500,000 and 3.3. That's an independent agency that Congress set up. You may not like the answer, but asking somebody else, an independent agency, to do it, I think is not going to get us any further down the line. I am personally struck by what my good friend from Idaho said, because as usual he's making sense, get to it, you know, deal with the notion. And I have opined in this committee and elsewhere that we know what to do. It's not that hard, that we could do things to rein in military spending without putting us at risk. We could reform agricultural spending. We could, in fact, move to have a healthcare system that rewards value instead of volume, that meets Mr. Bernanke's test, which isn't just in 10 years. The real test is 20 and 30 years that potentially sinks us. And I'm hopeful that we're able to focus on the big picture, that this Budget Committee, in the course of our deliberation, can look at things that actually enjoy bipartisan support that could make a difference over the next quarter century, and not have the picture that is being portrayed today and yesterday by independent experts become a fulfilling prophecy. I just feel from the bottom of my heart that this is something we ought to be focusing on, and in particular the notion that we are looking at the longer term. We live with a 10-year budget window, but the real challenges are beyond that. And that's where the savings have to occur. That's where it actually gets easier, not harder. And for us to bludgeon the Fed, and I think you've done an extraordinary job trying to balance being more transparent in what you're doing, but not spooking people, not adding fuel to one fire or the other. I appreciate your continued patience coming here, although I know it's probably a statutory duty, but you do it with
No, he's
good,
actually doing it on his own volition.
with good humor, and I don't know that we have subpoena power, but I'm hopeful that we can focus on the lessons that we learned or should have learned and get to the work that Mr. Simpson talked about in terms of getting to it.
Sounds like an
I'll
endorsement
yield.
of our budget.
I'll yield back. There,
Thanks.
I'm with you.
Okay, thank you. You are. Okay.
And I hope we
Your gentleman's time has expired. Agreed. Mr. Campbell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Dr. Bernanke. A suggestion was made earlier that you make policy pronouncements on housing, and I'm very deeply, as you know, involved in trying to restructure housing finance and the housing market. And as much as I personally wish that were true and that you would weigh in on the side of the proposals that I have made and versus others, you and the Fed have been, I think, quite judicious in not doing that. But what you have opined on, and I would like to ask you to say in your own words, is the importance of housing, the housing market and a housing recovery if we wish to have a robust economic recovery and job growth. Would you care to comment on?
Oh, I certainly would, and this is the reason that we have a housing committee, basically, at the Fed, which a bunch of staff and some governors who are looking at this almost all the time. I would say that one of the main reasons that the recovery has been as disappointing as it has been is that usually housing provides an important amount of the impetus to growth, not just construction, but all the related industries and services that are tied to housing. In this case, housing has been very weak. In fact, it really is, we've seen a few small positive indicators, but generally remains at a very low level. So the housing, the recovery in housing would be a very important boost to the overall recovery. It works through a number of different ways, not just through construction, but by affecting the wealth of consumers and their financial well-being. The mortgage market, the problems with access to credit, for example, mean that the Federal Reserve's monetary policies are less effective than they otherwise would be because not as many people as could be are taking advantage of the low mortgage rates that we have tried to create. There's a lot of other implications for both borrowers and lenders. Clearly, continued poor conditions in housing markets imply losses on mortgages, imply foreclosures, imply people underwater who can't move or sell their houses. So there are a lot of costs at the neighborhood and the household level as well. But I do think that the lack of a housing recovery is one of the big reasons that recovery has not been stronger than it has.
So without advocating a specific solution, kind of like on the budget deficits, you're saying it's something to which we should be paying policy attention.
I think it would repay your efforts to think about ways to make to remove some of the barriers to the recovery in housing. I don't think it's purely a market phenomenon. I think there are a number of legal and administrative and regulatory barriers to housing being as strong as it should be.
Thank you. Shifting gears for a second and going to Europe, could you comment on, in the last 30 days or 60 days, has a recovery or a positive solution in Europe, is it closer or farther away in your view? And can you, and we can't control this, but yet if they were to have a failure of some sort over there, which was not well constructed or whatever, that would affect us. Could you comment on where you think Europe is today and what impact it would have on us, even though we can't control it, if they were to have some form of failure or collapse?
Certainly, Congressman. So there have been a couple of positive developments. The European Central Bank has provided extensive financing to the European banking system and will provide another round of financing at the end of this month. That has had the benefit of reducing some of the stresses in the banking system. It has even gone so far as to bring down, to some extent, the borrowing costs of some of the more fiscally troubled countries as well. So that's taken away some of the financial stress and has given a little bit more breathing space. There's also been progress made in terms of a international agreement within the Eurozone to have mutual surveillance of fiscal policies to try and get long-term agreement on fiscal stability within the Eurozone and within individual countries, and that's a necessary condition for a full solution. So those are positive things. But there's an awful lot remains to be done. The Greek negotiations are still ongoing. We don't know how those are going to come out. The banking system remains undercapitalized. It's been contracting its credit, which has been contributing to a weakening in economy in many countries in Europe. And I think, you know, the backstops that are needed to protect, if one country has problems, to protect other countries from contagion. The Europeans have been setting up financial backstops to do that. There's still a lot of uncertainty about the size of those backstops and how they be used and so on. More work needs to be done there. But I think it's important to finally just to conclude that there are some really deep fundamental problems, not just fiscal issues, slow growth issues, but also issues of competitiveness. Countries on the periphery like Greece and Portugal are not at all competitive to Germany. They have big current account deficits. They cannot change the value of their exchange rate because they're tied to the euro. So it's going to be a very difficult process for them to get to a more competitive situation, and that all those things put together mean that you could have very slow growth in some European countries for quite a while.
Ms. Castor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning.
Morning.
Dr. Bernanke, the economy is creating jobs. We've had 22 months of private sector job growth. The unemployment rate is at its lowest level for 3 years. And it's very noticeable at home in Florida. You know, in 2007 and 2008, the headlines in the newspapers were devastating about companies closing and people losing jobs, and it's noticeably different. It was noticeably different last year with stories about companies hiring. It's pretty steady right now, but obviously we can do better. And I mean, you've said in your testimony, you said a more robust recovery will lead to lower deficits and debts in coming years. So here's the frustration, and our colleague who gave us the list of ways to reduce the debt and deficit, it was very noticeable that he did not include job creation in that list. It was cut spending. We're doing that in the Budget Control Act. We did that. We need to do more. Entitlements, there's some common ground we could find there. But he left off that very important list, job creation. And Dr. Elmendorf from the CBO testified yesterday that, yes, if we had a lower unemployment rate, we would have a lower deficit. And that followed up on his letter of October, where he used technical language, says the underutilization of capital and labor resources in the economy. If we had better utilization, if we had more people working, the projected federal deficit under the current law in fiscal year 2012 would be about 1/3 lower. That deficit would be equal to about 4.0% of gross domestic product, compared with 6.2% projected for 2012 in the CBO's baseline. If the economy were operating at its potential, the deficit would be lower because incomes and therefore revenues would be higher, while the rate of unemployment and therefore outlays for certain government programs would be lower. So here's our frustration, and the frustration of folks back home. They know we can be doing more to reduce the deficit and put people back to work, but the Congress has not been able to get off the dime and come to common agreement on ways we invest in infrastructure and research and development. So give us some words of wisdom on this. Going forward, what do you believe are the most effective policy options that of